something impossible happened in the throne room of the most powerful alien queen in the galaxy. She had ruled for 3,000 years. She had never cried. She had never trembled. She had never, not even once, lost control of her emotions in front of anyone. But on that day, everything changed. She stood completely still. Her hands stopped moving. Her eyes went wide. And for the first time in 3,000 years, the alien queen, the most feared ruler across 12 star systems, froze. And the reason she froze? 3 small children, half human, half alien, and completely, impossibly real. Nobody in the royal palace had ever seen anything like it. The royal guards stepped back. The advisors held their breath. Even the ancient holographic stars that floated above the throne room seemed to go quiet, because this was not supposed to happen. Her daughter was infertile. The royal healers had confirmed it 100 times. There was no cure, there was no hope, and there was certainly no possibility of children, especially not children who were half human. Humans were considered the weakest species in the known galaxy. Small, fragile, short-lived. They had no special powers, no advanced technology, no place in the royal bloodline of the most powerful alien empire ever known. And yet here they were, 3 tiny half-human, half-alien children standing inside the most powerful throne room in the universe, staring up at the alien queen with wide, innocent eyes. And she could not move. In this story, you are going to discover 3 things that will completely change the way you think about power, love, and what it truly means to be family. First, you will find out how a daughter who was told she could never have children ended up with 3 of the most extraordinary hybrid children the galaxy had ever seen. Second, you will discover the secret that the royal palace had been hiding for years, a secret so dangerous that it could have destroyed an entire empire. And third, you will witness the moment that broke a 3,000-year-old alien queen wide open and changed her forever. Let me show you exactly how this happened. The planet Valoris was not a place where weakness was allowed. It sat at the center of the Kethran Empire, surrounded by 12 conquered star systems, billions of loyal subjects, and a military force so powerful that no civilization had dared to challenge it in over 800 years. The sky above Valoris was always a deep shade of violet, lit by 2 distant suns that cast long golden shadows across the crystal towers of the royal city. And at the very top of that city, inside a palace that had stood for 3,000 years, lived Queen Sareva. She was tall. She was cold. She was precise in every single thing she did. Her skin was a deep, luminous shade of emerald green, smooth as polished stone, and almost glowing in the dim palace light. Her eyes were silver, not gray, not pale blue, but actual silver, like liquid metal, and when she looked at someone it felt like she could see straight through them, like she was reading every thought, every fear, every secret hiding in the back of their mind. She had ruled the Kethran Empire since she was young. She had built its military from a regional force into the most powerful army in the known galaxy. She had negotiated treaties, crushed rebellions, and expanded her empire across star systems that most civilizations had not even discovered yet. She was brilliant. She was ruthless. And she was deeply, deeply alone. Not because she had no one around her. The palace was always full of advisors, generals, servants, diplomats, and guards. There was never a quiet moment in the halls of the Kethran royal palace. But there is a difference between being surrounded by people and actually having someone. Queen Sareva had one child, her daughter Princess Lareva. Lareva was everything her mother was not. Where Sareva was cold and calculating, Lareva was warm and curious. Where Sareva walked through the palace like she owned every single corner of it, which technically she did, Lareva wandered through it like she was always looking for something she hadn't found yet. She asked questions that made the royal advisors uncomfortable. She spent hours in the palace archives reading about civilizations her mother had conquered. She was fascinated by art, by music, by languages, and most dangerously of all, by humans. Humans were a subject that made most Kethran citizens uncomfortable. They were a young species. They lived on a small blue planet called Earth, located at the very edge of the galaxy's outer spiral, far from any of the major trade routes or military zones. They had only recently developed space travel. Their technology was primitive compared to the Kethran Empire. Their lifespan was embarrassingly short. And they had no special abilities, no telepathy, no energy manipulation, no enhanced strength or speed. By every measurable standard, humans were considered one of the least significant species in the known galaxy. But Lareva found them fascinating. She had read every document in the royal archives about human civilization. She had studied their history, their art, their wars, their religions, their music. She had watched recordings of human cities from surveillance satellites, and spent hours trying to understand what it was like to live in a world where every single day mattered, because you only had so many of them. Her mother did not approve. Queen Sareva had made it very clear, on multiple occasions, that human civilization was not worth the princess's attention. They were a minor species on the outer edge of a galaxy that the Kethran Empire had already largely mapped and categorized. They were not a threat. They were not an ally. They were simply there, and they would continue to simply be there, until they either developed into something useful, or quietly faded into extinction like so many other minor species before them. Lareva had nodded politely every time her mother said these things, and then she had gone right back to reading about humans the moment her mother left the room. There was one other thing about Lareva that the royal palace kept very quiet. She could not have children. The royal healers had discovered this when Lareva was still a teenager. It was a rare condition among the Kethran, a biological anomaly that occurred in less than 1% of the population. In a normal Kethran family, it would have been a private sadness, a personal difficulty, something to grieve and eventually accept. But Lareva was not from a normal family. She was the only child of the queen of the most powerful empire in the galaxy. And in the Kethran royal tradition, the continuation of the bloodline was not simply a personal matter. It was a political necessity. The empire needed an heir. The bloodline needed to continue. And if Lareva could not have children, that meant the future of the entire Kethran royal dynasty was in serious question. Queen Sareva had brought in every healer, every scientist, every specialist across the 12-star systems of her empire. She had authorized research programs. She had funded experimental treatments. She had done everything in her considerable power to find a solution. Nothing worked. And slowly, quietly, the royal palace had accepted the truth. Lareva would not have children. The queen would need to find another solution for the succession, and Lareva herself would carry this private grief for the rest of her life. That was how things stood when the Kethran Empire made its first official contact with the planet Earth. It was not supposed to be a significant event. Earth was being catalogued as part of a standard survey of the outer spiral territories. A small diplomatic team was sent to make initial contact with Earth's governments, establish basic communication protocols, and assess whether the planet had anything worth including in the Kethran trade network. It was routine, bureaucratic, completely unremarkable by every standard the Kethran Empire used to measure these things. Lareva volunteered to lead the mission. Her mother said no. Twice. Lareva asked again, then again. Then she made a formal request through the Diplomatic Council, citing her extensive research into human civilization as a qualification that no other available diplomat could match. The council approved the request before Sareva could block it. The queen was not pleased. But she allowed it, partly because blocking it would have caused a political argument she did not have time for, and partly because, deep down, in a place she would never admit existed, she trusted her daughter's instincts even when she did not understand them. Lareva arrived on Earth in the 32nd year of her life, which in human terms made her appearance roughly equivalent to a 25-year-old woman. She was tall, green-skinned, silver-eyed, and completely unlike anything the humans had ever seen. The initial meetings were formal and slightly awkward on both sides. The human governments were nervous. The Kethran diplomatic protocols were stiff and unfamiliar. But one human was not nervous at all. His name was James Harlow. He was a translator and cultural liaison assigned to the diplomatic team by the British government. He was 28 years old, dark-haired, and had a habit of asking exactly the kind of questions that made people uncomfortable in a way that somehow ended up being refreshing rather than rude. He had spent years studying xenolinguistics in preparation for exactly this kind of moment, and he approached the arrival of an alien diplomatic team with the calm focus of someone who had been waiting his whole life for this, and was determined not to waste a single second of it. He and Lareva met on the third day of the diplomatic visit. She was asking questions about human art. He was the only one in the room who actually tried to answer them properly instead of deflecting to political talking points. They talked for 6 hours. When the session ended, Lareva requested that James Harlow be assigned as her primary cultural liaison for the remainder of the mission. The mission lasted 8 months. By the time it was over, something had happened that neither of them had planned, neither of them had expected, and both of them had tried very hard to be sensible about, and completely failed. Lareva left Earth. She returned to Valoris. She completed her diplomatic report, submitted her recommendations to the Trade Council, and went back to her life in the royal palace as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. And 3 months later, James Harlow received an encrypted message through a communication channel that officially did not exist, from a source that was officially not authorized to contact him, asking him one simple question. Would he come back? He said yes before he finished reading the message. Nobody in the royal palace knew. That was the first miracle, because keeping a secret inside the Kethrin royal palace was almost impossible. The palace had advisors who monitored communication channels. It had guards who rotated on precise schedules and reported everything they observed to the Queen's intelligence office. It had servants who had been trained since childhood to notice every detail of every person in every room. Information moved through the palace like water through stone, slowly but inevitably, finding every crack and eventually reaching the surface. And yet somehow, for almost 2 full years, nobody found out. James Harlow had been brought to Valoris through a private transport arrangement that Lareva had organized through a small independent trading company that operated in the outer spiral territories. He lived in a private residence in the lower districts of the royal city, far from the palace, in a neighborhood where off-world visitors were common enough that one more human face did not attract attention. He learned basic Kethrin language quickly. James had always been good with languages, and Kethrin, while complex, had a logical structure that his linguist's mind found satisfying to work through. Lareva visited when she could, not often, never in a pattern that could be predicted. She was careful in the way that someone is careful when they are fully aware of exactly how dangerous the situation is, and have decided that the danger is worth it. James was careful too. He understood the risk. He was a human living secretly in the capital city of an alien empire that officially regarded his species as a minor and largely irrelevant civilization. If the wrong people found out, the consequences would not simply be personal. They could be diplomatic, political, and given Queen Sareva's well-documented feelings about humans, they could potentially be much worse than that. But he stayed, and they were happy in the quiet, careful, deliberately small way that people are happy when happiness is something they have chosen to protect rather than display. It was during the 19th month of this arrangement that Lareva began to feel different. She was tired in a way that sleep did not fix. Her senses were sharper than usual. She could smell things from across the room that she should not have been able to detect. Her appetite changed. Her body temperature fluctuated in ways that did not match any pattern she recognized. She went to a healer, not a royal healer, a private physician in the outer districts, who worked with off-world patients and was known for discretion. She told the physician her symptoms. The physician ran a series of tests. And then the physician sat down very slowly, looked at Lareva with an expression somewhere between professional composure and barely contained astonishment, and said something that Lareva had been told, by the best royal healers in the Kethrin Empire, was biologically impossible. She was pregnant. Lareva sat in that small medical office in the outer district of the royal city for a very long time without speaking. The physician waited. Outside, the violet sky of Valoris was beginning to shift toward its evening color, a deep, rich indigo that the people of this world had always considered beautiful. Lareva was not looking at the sky. She was looking at the results of the medical test on the screen in front of her. She read them once. Then again. Then a third time. The results were clear. The pregnancy was confirmed. And there was something else in the test results. Something that made the physician's expression shift from astonishment to something much more cautious. The genetic signature of the developing life was not purely Kethrin. It was half-human. The physician said very quietly that this was unprecedented in the medical literature of the Kethrin Empire. that a cross-species pregnancy of this kind was not something anyone had documented before, that it raised biological questions that current Catherine medical science did not have answers to, and that, given all of this, the physician strongly recommended that Lareva seek specialized care and also consider very carefully who else needed to know about this situation. Lareva thanked the physician. She paid in untraceable currency. She walked out of the office and into the evening streets of the royal city, and she stood there for a long moment, looking up at the deep indigo sky, feeling the weight of something so enormous that she had no words for it yet. Then she went to tell James. He was quiet for a long time too. They sat together in the small apartment that had become their secret world. The lights were low. The city outside was doing the ordinary business of evening. Traders packing up their stalls, children being called inside, the distant hum of transport vehicles moving through the lower streets. Finally, James said, "What do you want to do?" And Lareva said, "I want to keep them." She did not know yet that it was going to be 3. That part came later, when a more detailed scan was performed by a specialist physician James had quietly contacted through a secure channel, a Catherine doctor who had worked extensively with mixed-species patients in the border territories, and who approached the situation with the calm focus of someone who found extraordinary medical cases professionally interesting rather than personally alarming. 3 children, healthy, developing in a way that was not quite Catherine and not quite human but something entirely new, a biological combination that should not have been possible, and yet clearly, undeniably was. Lareva looked at those scan results and felt something shift inside her, something deep and permanent and entirely beyond any logic or calculation. She was going to be a mother. Against every medical prediction, against every royal expectation, against the very biology of her own body, which had once been declared incapable of this. She was going to be a mother. And James, sitting beside her with his hand over hers, said very quietly, "They're going to be amazing." But there was still the question of the Queen. Lareva had not told her mother. She was not ready. She did not know how to begin that conversation. Queen Sareva had spent 30 years making her position on humans abundantly clear. She had built an empire on the principle that strength and purity of purpose were what mattered, that sentiment and attachment to lesser things were weaknesses that a ruler could not afford. What would she say when she found out that her daughter, the princess of the Catherine Empire, the heir to the most powerful throne in the galaxy, had not only fallen in love with a human, but was carrying 3 half-human children? Lareva did not know. And so she did the only thing she could do in that moment. She bought more time. She arranged a longer private residence. She found a way to explain her reduced public appearances at the palace. She managed the logistics of an impossible situation with the same careful precision her mother had always used to manage an empire. She managed. And she waited. And she hoped that by the time the truth could no longer be hidden, she would have found the right words. She did not find the right words. The truth found her instead. It was a servant who noticed first. Not because the servant was looking for anything. Not because there had been any specific suspicion or investigation. It was simply the ordinary, unavoidable consequence of living inside a palace where observation was part of everyone's job, and where nothing, no matter how carefully hidden, stayed hidden forever. The servant had been delivering a private communication to a lower district address on behalf of a palace administrative task. Completely routine, completely unrelated to anything involving the princess. But the address was on the same street as the apartment where James Harlow lived. And the servant had excellent eyes, and an excellent memory. And Princess Lareva, despite all her careful planning, had visited that day. The servant said nothing immediately. That was not unusual. In the Catherine Palace, information was a resource to be evaluated carefully before being used. The servant thought about what had been seen for 3 days, considered the possible explanations, weighed the risks of speaking against the risks of staying silent. On the 4th day, the servant requested a private meeting with the Queen's chief intelligence advisor. After that, things moved quickly. Within 48 hours, the intelligence office had identified James Harlow. They knew who he was, where he was from, how he had arrived on Valoris, and how long he had been there. They had a complete picture of the situation, everything except the medical details, which the physician had protected absolutely, and which the intelligence office had not yet reached. The chief intelligence advisor went to Queen Sareva. The queen listened to the full report without speaking. Her expression did not change. Her silver eyes remained steady. She asked 3 questions, precise, specific, focused entirely on facts rather than implications. The advisor answered each one. Then she said, "Leave me." She sat alone in her private chamber for a very long time. There were a lot of things happening inside Queen Sareva in those hours alone, but none of them showed on her face. That was something she had trained herself to do over 3,000 years of ruling. Keep everything inside. Show nothing. Process in private. Act in public. Never give anyone the satisfaction of seeing you struggle. She thought about her daughter. She thought about the years of careful management of the succession question. She thought about the political implications of a princess who had been living secretly in the city with a human. She thought about what the noble houses would say, what the military council would say, what the 12 occupied star systems would say when this inevitably became public. And then, underneath all of that, in the quiet place that she kept most carefully hidden, she thought about her daughter's face when she was happy. She called Lireva to the palace the next morning. Lireva came. She knew, from the formality of the summons, that the careful time she had bought was now completely gone. She walked into her mother's private chamber and looked at the queen's face, and understood immediately that this was not going to be a gentle conversation. She told her mother everything. All of it, James. The years on Valoris, the children. She said this part quietly but clearly, watching her mother's face as she said it. The pregnancy. The 3 half-human, half-Kethran children who would be born in approximately 4 standard months. Queen Sareva listened to all of it without interrupting. That was almost more frightening than if she had shouted. When Lireva finished speaking, there was a long silence. Then the queen said, "You understand what you have done." It was not a question. "Yes," Lireva said, "you understand what this means for the succession. For the bloodline. For the empire. Yes. And you did it anyway." Lireva met her mother's silver eyes. "I didn't plan it. But I don't regret it, and I won't apologize for loving someone." The queen stood up. She walked to the window of her private chamber and looked out over the royal city. The 2 suns of Valoris were rising, casting their long golden light across the crystal towers below. She said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "You will stay in the palace. The children will be born here, under royal medical care. We will manage the public information carefully." Lireva waited. "The human," Queen Sareva said, and the word was careful in a way that meant she was choosing not to use it as an insult, which was itself a kind of decision, "will remain in the city for now. We will determine a formal arrangement later." She did not look at her daughter when she said this. She kept looking out the window. Lireva said, very quietly, "Thank you." The queen said nothing, but her hands, clasped behind her back, tightened very slightly against each other. That was all. That was everything. It was not forgiveness, and it was not acceptance, and it was not warmth, but it was not destruction either. And for Lireva, in that moment it was enough. The children were born 4 months later. And that was when everything changed again. The birth of 3 half-human, half-Kethran children was unlike anything the royal medical team had ever managed before. The lead physician, the border territory specialist who had been monitoring the pregnancy, had prepared for every medical scenario she could think of. She had consulted remote specialists. She had reviewed every piece of cross-species medical literature in the Kethran database, which was not much, because this had truly never happened before. She had prepared equipment for both Kethran biological needs and human biological possibilities and several categories of unknowns in between. What she had not fully prepared for was how extraordinary these children would be. They were born healthy, all 3 of them, 2 girls and a boy. They were smaller than a typical Kethran infant, but larger than a typical human newborn. Their skin was a soft, pale version of Kethran green, Not the deep luminous emerald of their mother's species, but a gentle, almost golden green, like new leaves in early spring light. Their eyes were remarkable. They were not the pure silver of the Kethran, or the varied browns and blues and greens of humans. They were something between. A warm amber gold that caught the light and seemed to hold it, like small suns. They were beautiful. Every single person who saw them said so. Even the medical staff, who were professionals trained to observe rather than respond emotionally, found themselves pausing in their work to look at these three small faces, with expressions that belonged to wonder rather than medicine. James was there for the birth. Queen Sareva was not. That had been the arrangement. The Queen had made it clear that she would acknowledge the situation in whatever way was politically necessary. But she was not ready, that was the word she had used, not ready, to be present for the birth itself. So James held his daughter's hand, and the physician counted, and the royal medical team did their extraordinary, unprecedented work. And at the end of it, Lareva held three small golden-green children against her chest, and cried in a way she had not cried since she was very young. James sat beside her, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the moment did not already contain. They named them together. The eldest daughter, Ayalara, the second daughter, Sova, the son, Kyle. Each name was chosen carefully, neither purely Kethran nor purely human, but something that existed in the space between, which was where these children already lived. The children grew quickly in their first weeks, not at the speed of a Kethran infant, and not at the speed of a human infant, but at their own rate, which was, the physician noted with quiet professional fascination, slightly faster than either parent species alone. They were alert, responsive. They tracked movement with those warm amber eyes with an attention that seemed beyond their age, and they made sounds, not quite the vocal patterns of Kethran infants, and not quite the sounds of human babies, but a combination that was somehow more melodic than either. Lireva was happy in a way that filled every room she was in. James was overwhelmed in the ordinary, complete, life-changing way that new fathers are overwhelmed, except that his situation included the additional complexity of being a human man in an alien empire, trying to figure out how to be a father to three half-alien children while the Queen of said empire was in the same building and had not yet formally acknowledged his existence. The royal palace had adjusted around the presence of the children in the way that large, ancient institutions adjust around unexpected things. Slowly with resistance, but eventually. A suite of rooms had been prepared for Lareva and the children. A small team of medical staff had been assigned. Arrangements had been made for James to move from his outer district apartment to a residence within the palace complex. Not the main palace, but a connected residential building that gave him access to Lareva and the children without requiring a formal acknowledgement of his status. It was a careful, complicated, deeply imperfect arrangement. But it was a life. And it was theirs, the thing that nobody was talking about, the thing that everyone in the palace was aware of and nobody wanted to address directly, was what the Queen thought, what she felt, what she intended to do about the three small half-human children who were now living inside her palace, and who were, by blood if not by any official acknowledgement, her grandchildren. Queen Sareva had not visited them, not once in the 4 weeks since their birth. She had received daily medical reports. She had reviewed every update on their development. She knew their names, their weights, their developmental progress. She had read the physician's detailed notes about their unique biological characteristics, with the careful attention she gave to all important intelligence. But she had not seen them. Not until the morning that Ilara, the eldest, did something that no one had expected. The children were in Lareva's suite of rooms, which was in the east wing of the main palace, closer to the Queen's private chambers than James had known, which he discovered only later, and which he suspected was not accidental. Lareva was resting. James was sitting on the floor nearby. The three children were on a soft blanket, doing the various things that very young infants do. And Ayalara, at approximately 6 weeks old, reached out one small hand toward the doorway of the room and said a sound. Not a random infant sound. A specific, directed, clearly intentional sound. A sound that was, unmistakably, the beginning of a word in Kethran. James stared at her. Lareva, who had been resting with her eyes closed, opened them. The medical attendant who was present dropped something, and in the doorway of the room, completely still, was Queen Sareva. She had been passing by. That was what she told herself later, though the East Wing was not on any route she typically took, and the royal schedule showed no reason for her to be in that corridor at that time. She had simply been passing by, and she had stopped, drawn by something she did not want to name, standing in the doorway of her daughter's rooms, looking at 3 small children on a soft blanket on the floor, and the eldest one had reached toward her, and made a sound that was the beginning of a greeting in Kethran. Nobody moved. Queen Sareva stood in the doorway, and looked at those 3 small faces looking back at her, and something happened inside her, that she had no category for, something that bypassed every protocol, every calculation, every 3,000 years of practiced stillness. Her eyes changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that most people would have noticed. But James noticed, and Lareva noticed, and the medical attendant noticed, and would talk about it for the rest of her career in very quiet, careful tones. The Queen's silver eyes went soft. She did not come into the room that day. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the 3 children. Then she looked at Lareva, then at James, briefly, with an expression that was not warm, but was not hostile either. It was the expression of someone doing a rapid and complex recalculation. Then she looked at the children again. Then she said, quietly, the eldest. She has a strong voice for her age. And she left. But she came back the next day. And the day after that. Each visit was brief. She did not announce herself. She simply appeared in the doorway or the entrance of whatever room the children were in. She would stand and observe for a few minutes. She would say something precise and non-emotional, a comment on the children's development, a question for the physician about a specific biological marker, a brief acknowledgement of something the children had done. And then she would leave. This went on for 10 days. On the 11th day, she came in the evening, when the light in Lareva's suite was low and warm, and the children had just been fed. Alara was awake, the other 2 drowsy. Lareva was sitting with all 3 of them, speaking to them softly in a combination of Kethran, and what James had taught her of English. This was something she had started doing instinctively, talking to them in both languages as though their dual heritage should be present in their ears from the very beginning. James was across the room. He had learned, over the past 10 days, to stay quiet and still during the Queen's visits. Not to make himself invisible exactly, but not to make himself a focus either. He understood that he was part of the problem the Queen was still processing, and that adding himself to the equation too prominently during these early visits was not helpful. Queen Sareva came in that evening and stood near the edge of the blanket where the children were resting. Alara looked up at her with those warm amber eyes. And then Alara did something new. She smiled. Not a reflex. Not a random facial movement. A real, deliberate, directed smile. Aimed straight at the tall emerald green figure standing above her. It was a completely ordinary thing. Babies smile. That is something they do. But it was also, at that exact moment, the most disarming thing that had ever happened in 3,000 years of Kethran royal history. Queen Sareva went completely still. This was the moment, the one that the medical attendant would describe later, the one that Lareva would tell her children about when they were old enough to understand, the one that James would write about in a journal he kept in English, hidden in a drawer, full of observations that he was saving for a time when it felt safe to speak them aloud. The Queen stood completely still. Her hands, which were always precise and controlled, hung at her sides without moving. Her silver eyes were fixed on Ilara's smiling face, and something moved through her expression. Something old, and vast, and very quiet, like a change in weather that begins so deep in the atmosphere that you feel it before you can name it. Then, she did something that nobody in the palace had ever seen her do. She slowly knelt down. Not the formal kneel of a ceremony or a ritual, not a gesture with any political meaning, just a woman lowering herself to the ground so that she could be closer to a small child who had smiled at her. She reached out one hand. Her fingers, long, elegant, green, the hands that had signed military orders and diplomatic treaties, and the political fate of 12-star systems, hovered near Alara. Alara grabbed one of her fingers with both small hands and held on. The queen made a sound, very small, very quiet, almost nothing. But it was there. Lareva was watching with tears moving silently down her face. James was watching with his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. Even the other two children, Sova and Kale, seemed to have gone very still, as though some instinct in them understood that something important was happening. Queen Sareva looked down at the small hands wrapped around her finger. Then she looked at Ailara's face. Then, for the first time since this whole impossible story had begun, she looked directly at James. He met her eyes. They looked at each other for a long moment. Then the queen said, speaking directly to him for the first time since she had learned of his existence, "She has your hands." James looked at Ailara's small fingers wrapped around the queen's. And he said, very quietly, "She has her mother's eyes." Something shifted in the queen's expression. Not a smile, not yet. Something that was preparing the ground for a smile. The way you might clear space before building something. She looked back at Ailara, then at Sova and Kael, then back at Ailara, and she said, to no one in particular, and to all of them at once, "They are remarkable." It was 3 words. In a language and a palace and a galaxy where 3 words could mean almost nothing or everything, depending on who said them. And from Queen Sareva, in that room, on that evening, kneeling on the floor with a small half-human hand wrapped around her finger, they meant everything. Things did not change immediately after that evening. Change, in a place like the Kethrin Royal Palace, did not happen in single moments even when single moments started it. It happened the way everything significant happens, slowly, piece by piece, through a series of smaller changes that were each individually manageable, and that together, over time, added up to something completely different from where you started. Queen Sareva began visiting every day. The visits became longer. The formality of them gradually, carefully, reduced. She stopped standing at the edge of the room and started sitting within it. She began speaking to the children directly, using their names, asking them questions even in the weeks when they could not answer. Speaking to them in the precise, careful way she spoke to everyone but with something underneath it that was not precision at all. She began to learn things. She learned that Kale was calmer than his sisters, and that he would fix his amber eyes on something and study it with an intensity that made the physician say, quietly, that he had a Kethrin mind. She learned that Sova was the loudest and most determined of the 3, and would make her needs known with a directness that, the queen noted with something that might have been private amusement, reminded her of herself. She learned that Alara was the most social, the one most likely to reach toward a new face, most likely to smile first, most likely to close the distance between herself and a stranger, with the uncomplicated confidence of someone who has decided that connection is worth the risk. She learned James. That took longer. And it was harder. Because James was the part of the equation that carried the most weight, the human, the outsider, the reason the bloodline was now half of something her empire had spent centuries regarding as beneath notice. Managing her feelings about the children was one thing. They were here. They were real. They were undeniably hers in a way that bypassed every category she had ever used to organize the world. James was different. James was a choice her daughter had made. A choice that had upended the royal succession, complicated the politics of the empire, and required an enormous amount of careful management to keep from becoming a public crisis. But she watched him. With the same careful observational precision she applied to everything, she watched how he was with the children, how he talked to them, how he held them, how he never seemed to need to perform fatherhood for an audience. It was just something he was doing, quietly and completely, without any interest in being seen doing it. She watched how he was with Lareva, the way he stayed slightly behind her in any official context, understanding without being told that this was her world and her role and her story. The way he caught her eye across a room when something happened that was funny or strange or difficult, and the way that small private look between them was clearly a whole language of its own. She watched him learn Catherine. He was getting good. Better than she had expected. He made mistakes that made Lareva laugh, and made the children, once they started talking, repeat enthusiastically and incorrectly. He accepted being corrected with the easy grace of someone who is not embarrassed by not knowing things. One evening she found him alone in the library of the East Wing. He was reading a Catherine history text, one of the oldest in the palace archives, not digitized, the original material format, handled with the kind of careful respect that most members of the royal court did not bother with. She asked what he was reading. He told her he had found a section about the founding of the empire, the first queen, 4,000 years ago, and the wars she had fought to unite the 12 systems. He said it was extraordinary. He said it with the genuine, unperformed enthusiasm of someone who had actually read the text and found it genuinely interesting. She sat down. They talked for an hour about the founding of the Catherine Empire, about the strategic decisions of the first queen, about the political philosophy that had held the 12 systems together for 4,000 years. James asked good questions, not political ones, not the questions of someone trying to impress or manipulate, the questions of someone who was genuinely curious and had been paying close attention. When she left the library that evening, the queen thought, in the most private and carefully guarded part of her mind, that her daughter had chosen someone with a good mind. She did not say this to anyone, but she thought it. The formal acknowledgement came 6 months after the birth of the children. Queen Sareva convened a session of the Royal Council, a formal official session, with full attendance from all the noble houses and military representatives of the 12-star systems. The session was listed on the official calendar as a routine succession matter. What she announced was not routine. She acknowledged Alara, Sova, and Kael as royal children of the Catherine bloodline. She used specific legal language that had not been used in Catherine royal history before, language that she had had the Royal Legal Council draft over the previous 2 months, language that created a category that had not previously existed. Half-blooded royals, children of dual heritage, full members of the royal family, full claimants of Catherine royal status, without the removal or denial of their human heritage. The noble houses were not universally pleased. There were objections, carefully worded, politically framed, but objections nonetheless. 3 of the noble house representatives requested formal meetings with the Queen to discuss their concerns. Queen Sareva met with each of them personally. The meetings were brief. The noble house representatives emerged from each one having been listened to, taken seriously, and redirected, with complete firmness and no apparent anger, to a consideration of what the Catherine Empire had always been built on, which was not bloodline purity but strength, intelligence, and the capacity to adapt and endure. By the time all 3 meetings were done, the objections had been formally withdrawn. The announcement also addressed James. He was given an official status, not a Catherine title, because there was no existing Catherine title that fit what he was, and the Queen had decided that creating a fake-fitting title would be worse than creating an accurate new one. He was designated Father of the Royal Heirs and Cultural Representative of Earth, which was a title that had never existed before, and that the Royal Council spent approximately 4 days trying to find a precedent for, before accepting that there was none. James, when Lareva told him, was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your mother is extraordinary." Lareva said, "She is." James said, "Is she always like this? When she decides to do something, it's just complete, total. She doesn't halfway do anything." Lareva smiled. "No. She never halfway does anything." There was a small formal ceremony at the end of the council session. The children were brought into the throne room. All 3 of them, 8 months old now, sitting up, looking around at the enormous golden hall with wide amber eyes. Alara reached immediately for the nearest decorative element within range, which happened to be the formal robe of a senior military general, and grabbed it with both hands. The general stood very still, not sure what the protocol was for this situation. Queen Sareva, standing at the front of the room, watching, did something that the assembled council had not seen her do in the memory of most of those present. She smiled. Not a diplomatic smile, not a political smile, a real one, sudden, unguarded, reaching all the way to her silver eyes. She looked at Ilara holding the general's robe and she smiled. And for a moment she was not the 3,000-year-old ruler of the most powerful empire in the galaxy. She was a grandmother watching her granddaughter do something ridiculous and charming and completely ordinary. The moment lasted only a second. Then she composed herself. Then she continued with the ceremony in her precise, formal way. But everyone in that room had seen it. And everyone in that room understood that something had shifted in the foundations of the Kethron Empire. Something that could not be shifted back, and that nobody, if they were honest, actually wanted to shift back. The children grew. They became the strangest and most wonderful things in the royal palace, not strangers to either of their worlds, not entirely belonging to either, but making their own belonging out of everything they had inherited. They spoke both languages without thinking about which one they were using. They moved through the palace with the easy confidence of children who are deeply loved, and who know it. They brought things into the palace that it had not had in a long time. Mess, noise, laughter. The ordinary chaos of small people existing fully in a space that had been controlled and formal for thousands of years. Queen Sareva adapted to this with a grace that surprised everyone, including herself. She learned to work around the chaos rather than eliminating it. She learned that Kale would climb anything left within reach, and that the solution was not to remove everything from reach but to designate acceptable climbing objects and redirect accordingly. She learned that Sova had an opinion about everything, and that the fastest way through any situation involving Sova was to let her express the opinion, acknowledge it seriously, and then explain the actual plan. She learned that Ilara would befriend anyone, servants, guards, foreign diplomats, kitchen staff, visiting dignitaries, with the same open warmth, and that this was not a security problem but an asset, because Ilara's instinct for people was remarkable and worth paying attention to. She told Lareva one evening, after a particularly involved day that had included Sova's loud and detailed objection to her afternoon rest schedule, "Your eldest daughter is going to be a diplomat. Your second will command armies. Your son will know things." Lareva said, "You sound like you've already decided." The queen said, simply, "I've been watching." And there was something in that, in the fact that she had been watching, paying attention, learning these three small people with the same careful attention she gave to everything that mattered to her, that said more than any formal acknowledgement ever could. James, in his English journal, wrote about it this way. He wrote that he had been afraid when he came to Valoris, not of danger exactly, but of being invisible, of being the human, the lesser thing, in a world where everything was scaled for people who were stronger and longer lived and more powerful than him. He had been afraid of being tolerated rather than seen. He wrote that he had been wrong. He wrote that Queen Sareva, in her precise and unsentimental way, had done something he had not expected. She had seen him. Not quickly, not easily, not without significant resistance from everything she had built herself to be. But she had gotten there. And when she saw something, she did not halfway see it. He wrote that his children were the most extraordinary people he had ever known, and that they were extraordinary not despite being half of two different worlds but because of it. Because they held both things simultaneously and made something new out of the combination. And that watching them do this, watching them move between Kethron and human with the ease of people who had never known a world where these things were separate, was the most hopeful thing he had ever seen. And he wrote, at the end of that entry, that the alien queen who had once frozen in a doorway seeing three small half-human faces looking up at her, had become, in the quiet, undramatic, completely real way that people become things, their grandmother. Not a concept, not a political designation, not a formal acknowledgement in a council session, their grandmother. The one who knew which of them would be a diplomat, and which would command armies, and which would know things. The one who let Ilara hold her finger, and Sova argue with her, and Kale climb her chair when he thought she wasn't paying attention. He wrote that he had never expected to feel at home in an alien empire, but somehow, against every logic, and every statistic and every cultural and biological barrier in the known galaxy, he did. Here is the thing that nobody saw coming. 2 years after the formal acknowledgement of the children, the Kethron Empire received a diplomatic request from a coalition of 7 minor species in the outer spiral territories. These were species that had previously avoided any contact with the Kethron Empire because of its reputation for aggressive expansion, and its clear position of dominance over any civilization it encountered. They requested contact specifically because of the children. News of the half-human royal heirs had spread, quietly and then less quietly, through the outer territories. For species who had spent generations watching the Kethran Empire expand toward them with no particular consideration for their existence, the announcement of 3 half-human children in the royal bloodline was extraordinary. It meant something they had not thought possible. It meant that the empire could change, that it was capable of including rather than simply absorbing, that the queen of the most powerful civilization in the galaxy had looked at something entirely outside her own world and found a way to make space for it. The coalition's request for contact was the first voluntary diplomatic outreach toward the Kethran Empire from any non-member civilization in 400 years. Queen Sareva received the request personally. She read it twice. Then she called Lareva to her private chamber, and she said in her precise, direct way, "Your decision to follow your heart has opened 7 diplomatic doors that 400 years of military expansion could not." Lareva said, "That wasn't why I did it." "I know," the queen said. "That is precisely why it worked. This is the thing that empires built on power and control do not usually understand, that the things which cannot be planned, the love that crosses species boundaries, the children who exist between worlds, the grandmother who kneels on the floor because a baby smiled at her, are sometimes the things that change everything. Not through strategy, not through calculation, through simple, stubborn, unreasonable reality." The children grew up to be exactly what their grandmother had predicted. Elara became a diplomat, whose ability to move between cultures with genuine understanding was unmatched in the Empire's history. Sova joined the military and eventually commanded the Kethran fleet, the first half-human commander in Imperial history, with an intensity and a clarity that her great-grandmother would have recognized immediately. Kale became a scientist whose work on cross-species biology drew on the living experience of his own extraordinary body and opened medical possibilities that changed what was considered possible for dozens of species across the galaxy. And through all of it, they carried both their worlds with them, not as a burden, not as a complication, but as the thing that made them what they were. James lived on Valoris for the rest of his life. He lived long. The medical team that monitored the family discovered early that something in the Kethran living environment, combined with access to Kethran medical technology, extended human lifespan considerably. He outlived the expectation of any human by decades. He kept his journal in English until the very end, adding to it with the careful attention of someone who understood that he was recording something worth recording. Queen Sareva outlived him. She outlived most things, as she always had. She continued to rule for another 800 years after the day she stood frozen in the doorway of her daughter's room. But people who knew her, really knew her, the ones who were close enough to see behind the 3,000-year-old wall of precision and control, said that she was different after that day. Not softer, exactly. Not less decisive, or less brilliant, or less formidable. But something had been added. Some dimension of her that had been closed for a very long time had opened. And she had not closed it again. She kept a recording of the children's first year in her private chamber. Not publicly. Not as a political statement. Just there, in her private room, where only she saw it, the recording that she apparently played most often, that the one servant who had ever seen it described to their own grandchildren, quietly, as something they were not supposed to have witnessed, was not of a formal ceremony or a significant moment. It was just an ordinary evening in the East Wing suite. Lareva talking to the children in 2 languages. James on the floor nearby, the 3 children on their blanket, doing the various ordinary things that very young infants do. And Elara, reaching out one small hand toward the doorway, toward something just off the edge of the recording's frame. Smiling. If this story opened your eyes to what love and family can really look like, then you are already asking the right questions. Let's bring it all together, because this story carried some extraordinary ideas worth holding on to. A daughter who was told she could never have children ended up with 3 of the most remarkable children the galaxy had ever seen. Not because the biology changed, but because love found a way through circumstances that logic had declared impossible. A queen who had ruled for 3,000 years on the principle that strength required the elimination of weakness, discovered that the greatest thing that ever happened to her empire began with exactly the kind of connection she had spent centuries dismissing. And 3 children who existed between 2 worlds turned out to be more powerful ambassadors for peace than any military force the empire had ever built. The truth this story keeps coming back to is simple. The things we are certain are impossible are sometimes just the things that haven't happened yet. And the connections that cross every boundary, of species, of culture, of expectation, of what we have decided the world should look like, are sometimes the ones that change everything. If this story pulled you in, and you want more stories that explore extraordinary worlds, impossible connections, and the kind of science fiction that actually makes you feel something, hit the subscribe button right now so you never miss what comes next. And if you have someone in your life who loves a story that goes somewhere unexpected, share this video with them today. For the next video on this channel, we are exploring another extraordinary hefty story, one that begins with humanity being considered the weakest species in the galaxy, and ends somewhere that will completely rearrange your ideas about what strength actually means. You do not want to miss it. And here is the question for the community today. Tell me in the comments, if you had to choose one of the 3 children to follow on their journey, which one would it be? Ayalara the diplomat, Sova the commander, or Kael the scientist? Drop your answer below. There is no wrong choice. But I am genuinely curious which path pulls you in. Thank you for watching. This story belonged to all of us today.